news delivery. It's a big deal. When you give a good report, how do you go about doing that? If you have a bad one, how do you go about doing that? Let's talk about the issues. A news delivery, unfortunately, everybody, especially those in leadership, occasionally has to deliver bad news in the world of business. It could be a layoff. It could be a notice you didn't get a promotion. It could be a move. It could be you lost an account. It could be whatever. There's bad feelings always associated with it, and it can be reduced if the receiver knows the reason for the letdown, feels the news was revealed sensitively, and believes the matter was treated seriously and fairly. Listen, on all these issues, people have feelings. I know they're employees. Some people view them as just pawns in the process and whatever. It's real, and they will carry that sometimes the rest of their lives. I've had to lay people off. I've had to terminate people's employment. I've had to put them on unpaid leave for inappropriate behavior. Most of that's brought on by themselves, okay, especially about the behavior part. But the reality of it is, if you attack the person, you're always wrong. If you attack the behavior, that is your role as an employer, because that behavior affects the workplace. So pay attention to how you deliver it, even on good news in the process. So setting goals for negative news. If you have bad news, negative news, here's the goals. Explain clearly and completely, because people will have questions. Convey empathy and sensitivity. Be professional. Be fair. I had to deliver news one time, well, multiple times actually, and I had supervisors saying, this employee is bad, and I had to be the one to deliver the bad news to them. But I make a point of always listening to the other side. A couple times I had to reverse the supervisor's decision, because the supervisor had the appearance of this perspective when I started asking questions over here, and then they did some follow-up investigations in the process. I found I wasn't getting the whole story. Make certain you hear both stories, because that's what we call fairness. Maintain friendly relations. If there's an issue on behavior, deal with the issue of behavior. Here's the behavior that we have, okay, and here's the consequences of it, how it affects the organization. It violates policies and procedures. Name them specifically so you're on the same page, but don't sit down and say you, because we talked about you being a bad word, and it usually is. So here's a rule in all business: good news in public, bad news in private. Don't publicly reprimand somebody. Now, occasionally you may have to. I was in a situation where I was a chief business officer for a college, and so I was assigned to deal with all the operating engineers for all 5 colleges in their district. Well, they're a tough crew, and they're very specialized. They know a lot more about mechanical systems than I ever will. So on the very first day in the job, I had a meeting with my 14 new subordinates that are going to report to me. And so we're sitting around the table, and one guy sat there and he had a question. He says, how are we going to sit down and deal with you? You don't know a thing about our job. And so I had to be calm, cool, and collected. And I says, you know what? You do know a lot more about the technical aspects of your job. I know an awful lot more about people. And here's a reality. I think you're inappropriate, and you and I'll be talking about that on a private basis. Boom. The whole room went quiet, because they knew I follow up on things like that, and I did. Okay, he got the message. He was inappropriate. If he has questions, sit down and do that. You want to challenge me publicly? I don't got a problem with that, but make certain that I'm going to deal with it privately the way it should be. So I brought it down, and it really worked out really well. He ended up being a pretty decent employee, but it took a couple hard knocks like that to get him on the line. So you have that sometimes. There's a rule for leaders. If you do something that most people construe would be bad, like delivering bad news, do it in person. Do not be a cheesy, wimpy supervisor that sends a text message or leaves a voicemail or sends an email. Frankly, if you don't know how to do that, if you don't have the guts to sit down and convey a decision that you made face-to-face, you really are not cut out to be a supervisor. I know it's a strong opinion, but it's mine. And the reality, I've seen the weak supervisors, and they've been sometimes they sit there and try to get other people to do their dirty work. I had a supervisor one time, he wanted me in human resources. Can you put camera down in the supervisor's room, his office? I said, what's the problem? He says, well, he has a crew of 17 people that work the shift, and everybody goes out except for 5 people, and he spends 2 to 3 hours, I hear, every single night talking to them, and while the other ones are doing all the work. And so in my mind, I'm thinking about custodians, thinking they work the 11 o'clock to 7 a.m. shift. And so I said, well, why don't you just show up and tell them? And he says, well, we'd rather have human resources put a camera down there and we can catch them in the act. I says, well, I says, going down there is not a big deal. He said, well, I don't have to go down there. I says, why? He said, well, the shift starts at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I says, you work till 5. What's your problem? Go down there and talk to them. We'd rather have HR do it. I says, here's how this is going to work. You need to go down there, talk to your supervisor who reports directly to you. And frankly, if you don't do that, then I'll be talking to the president of the college. You need to do your job. And then I promptly sent him an email telling him what I told him, copied the president, and expected him to go do that. Now, the issue came down to, as a supervisor, he was trying to pawn off the hard work on human resources to blame them, those people. They made me do it. They made me do it. You know, if you have to sit down and do that, step out of the role because you really don't belong there. Because sometimes being a boss is tough. It's tough work. And sometimes there's rewards with it. But the reality of it comes down to is that you need to do the job and be the person that's respectable, and don't cheese out with an aspect of sending an email or a text. That's so unprofessional. Some claim to be leaders that send bad news by text or even email. Don't even bother doing that, because everybody should be treated with dignity and respect. That's part of the role of being a leader. They take responsibility for their actions. Leading is hard work. It is often thankless work. Leaders have to get up every day and look into the mirror and really answer the question, did I do the right thing? Welcome to leadership. It's hard, and sometimes you have to do a difficult thing, but that is part of the thing. As soon as you sit down and decide, I want to be a boss, I want to be a leader, that's the price you're going to pay. There's moments you have an employee who's excelled, and you get to praise them. A leader who has values and stands before the employees and tells them of a problem and the resolution, regardless of how painful, that's what leadership is about. People deserve good leadership, and are you worthy of it? News delivery. There's good and bad news. It all goes through the aspect of leadership. Here in business communications, it's about training you to sit down there and excel in the workplace, in the world of business. Take care.